The morning heat clung low over Desert Ridge Air Base, rising off the concrete like ghost steam from yesterday's war. Technicians moved with quiet purpose, lugging tools and wiping sweat before it settled, but all motion slowed as Captain Chad Harrington strutted onto the tarmac. He was the kind of officer who wore sunglasses even indoors, who believed his reflection was owed a salute. Beside Hangar 3, Sarah Miles stood alone. Her coveralls faded at the seams and sleeves rolled just high enough to reveal worn wrists. She didn't flinch when Harrington called her out. His voice carried like a trumpet through the open air, soaked with the kind of charm that curdled into cruelty. "Let's see if the wrench lady knows more than torque specs," he said, waving toward the Griffin X9 parked in the sun like a coiled predator. The crowd laughed. Phones came up. No one questioned his challenge because no one expected her to do anything but fumble. Sarah didn't argue. She just walked toward the aircraft, steady and unsmiling, while whispers bloomed behind her. Most thought she'd refuse. A few hoped she'd cry. No one, not even Harrington, imagined she'd actually climb inside. The flight suit they handed her looked like it had been pulled from a mop closet. It sagged around her waist and smelled faintly of oil and heat. Harrington smirked as she zipped it halfway and adjusted the cracked helmet that didn't fit quite right. Up close, the Griffin X9 was all edges and muscle, with turbines that hummed even at rest. Sarah placed one hand on the fuselage like she was greeting an old friend. Then she climbed in without hesitation and lowered the canopy behind her. Inside, the world went quiet. She settled into the seat and let her hands hover for a second. Not trembling, just waiting. Her breath deepened, chest expanding, then slowing again, the way someone exhales before slipping underwater. Outside, someone shouted for her to smile for the camera. Someone else joked about insurance. Harrington laughed the loudest, but she didn't hear any of it. Her fingers began moving, not from memory but from instinct. Switches flipped, dials turned, systems blinked to life one by one in perfect sequence. No hesitation, no second guesses. A low, rising whine filled the hangar. The turbines spun up with a clean whir, the cockpit screens lighting up in green and blue across the board. The startup that should have taken 5 minutes was done in less than 2. Harrington's smile vanished. The crowd stopped laughing. One by one, phones lowered. No one had seen her check a manual. No one saw her pause. And no one could explain how a mechanic in borrowed gear had just brought a Griffin to full readiness without breaking a sweat. Sarah sat still, eyes forward, hands resting now, but not idle. Her face didn't glow with pride or fear. It held something else: stillness, precision, control. And in that stillness, the entire base suddenly remembered how silence feels when it isn't empty. It's heavy, it's waiting, it's respect landing all at once. At the far edge of Desert Ridge, past the fuel tanks and forgotten storage sheds, stood a faded green container that most people assumed was unused. Its metal walls bore sun-bleached patches and rusted corners, but inside it was clean, organized, and quietly lived in. This was Sarah Miles's home, a space no bigger than a supply closet, holding everything she still trusted. Every morning before first light broke over the horizon, Sarah laced up her worn boots and ran the perimeter of the airfield. 4 miles, always the same path, always alone. Her stride was steady, not fast, but relentless, as if she needed the ground under her feet to keep her anchored. She kept her hair tied back tight, not for vanity, but to stay focused. Her coveralls were always clean, her tools lined up with surgeon-like precision. She never complained, never raised her voice, and never missed a step in her checklist. People called her quiet, strange, maybe too serious. Some joked that she loved machines more than people. What they didn't know was that Sarah had once flown machines that outran sound and touched the edge of space. Years ago, she wasn't Sarah Miles at all. She was Captain Sarah Holloway, squadron leader of the Valkyrie unit, youngest female pilot to lead a combat wing in the Air Force. She didn't just fly jets. She commanded them. She breathed in the cockpit's recycled oxygen like it was freedom. There had been a time when people saluted her in hallways and paused when she walked into a room. She had respect rank, and the sky. But that version of Sarah died in a courtroom, buried under false testimony and shredded orders. Her fall wasn't slow. It was engineered. Her superior officer sold mission intel to the wrong hands, and when the ambush came, Sarah was blamed for the fallout. The investigation was a farce, fast-tracked and brutal. Within a month, she was stripped of her tidal wings and dignity. General Briggs tried to intervene, but his transfer came too late. The system closed around her like a locked cockpit door, and once it did, no one came knocking. So she changed her name, cut her hair, and walked away from everything that once defined her. On her first day as a maintenance tech, she showed up in silence and never gave them a reason to look closer. 8 years passed like this, one repair order at a time, one aircraft at a time, until her hands were known better than her name. Inside the container beneath her cot, she kept a small metal box. It was the only thing that came with her from her old life. Inside were 3 items: a pilot badge tarnished around the edges, still bearing the 4-star emblem of her squadron, a photo of her standing beside her jet, grinning without armor, and a folded letter yellowed and soft from being read too many times. The letter was from Lieutenant Mark Reyes, written just hours before his final mission. He called her the best commander he'd ever flown with. He said if anything happened, it wasn't on her. He said they trusted her completely. Then he was gone. Sometimes, when the weight in her chest grew too heavy to carry, she took out that letter and read it again. She never cried, but her fingers would pause on his name, holding the memory like something still warm. Sarah didn't live with bitterness. She lived with purpose. Every bolt she tightened, every engine she rebuilt was her quiet way of staying close to what she lost. It wasn't flying, but it was still sky adjacent. She never tried to explain herself. Not to the men who laughed at her calloused hands. Not to the pilots who tossed coffee cups without looking where they landed. Her worth didn't live in their approval. It lived in what she chose to remember. Every day she walked past jets she would never fly again and kept her eyes forward. Not because she'd given up, but because some truths are better lived than spoken. And one day, without knowing it, the skies would remember her name. At Desert Ridge Air Base, rank spoke louder than words. Pilots walked like they owned the sky and the concrete it touched, their names stitched in bold above polished uniforms. Around them, the ground crew moved in near silence, essential but invisible. It was a place where mechanics were expected to disappear after the job was done. No one asked for their opinions. No one remembered their names unless something broke. The pilots called them wrench monkeys or background noise, never in earshot but always with a smirk. The divide was more than just pay grade. It was culture reinforced daily like morning drills. Captain Chad Harrington was the worst of them. His laugh echoed louder than engine tests, and his swagger filled more space than his jet ever could. With a powerful father in Congress and perfect flight scores on paper, he was untouchable. He cracked jokes at briefings, called techs grease-stained gremlins, and handed off complaints with a lazy flick of his wrist. Officers nodded along or looked away. No one called him out because no one dared. Sarah Miles learned early not to draw attention. She kept her head down, tools clean, and reports precise. When someone handed her a clipboard without looking up, she took it without a word. They called her Wrench Lady when they remembered her at all. No one questioned why she knew systems inside and out or how she could solve malfunctions that left younger techs stumped. They assumed she had nothing better to do. Every time she corrected a wiring issue or recalibrated a power core, someone joked that she must sleep with the manual under her pillow. No one imagined she'd once written parts of it. No one asked. She stood in briefing rooms like furniture. She waited by the aircraft while pilots fumbled their pre-flight checks. When she offered advice, it was usually met with a smirk or a hand wave. The culture didn't need to scream to keep its order. It whispered through habits inside jokes, and glances passed around like smoke. Pilots high-fived after landings while techs hauled busted parts through the heat. Respect was something earned only if you wore a flight suit. Everything else was second tier. Sarah had worn that suit once, but now it was just another layer of sweat-soaked cotton between her and the truth. She didn't resent them. She just watched, listened, and waited. Some part of her knew that the air didn't care about rank. Only people did. Every day she walked past Harrington's squadron with her tools in hand. She caught the way his eyes slid over her like checking a fuel gauge he didn't trust. And she let him. Not because she was weak, but because strength doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it sharpens itself in silence. And at Desert Ridge, silence was the one thing they never understood. The Liberty Storm briefing room buzzed with noise and swagger. Pilots filled the chairs like kings around a war table, tossing jokes and chewing gum with the ease of people who'd never been questioned. Sarah stood against the back wall holding a clipboard she didn't need watching, without speaking. Captain Harrington leaned back in his seat, arms behind his head boots crossed the embodiment of careless confidence. He scanned the room with a grin that usually meant trouble. Then his eyes landed on Sarah, and the grin sharpened. He raised his voice just enough to carry, said maybe it was time one of the wrench team got a real look at what pilot life was like. Said Sarah asked more questions than anyone, so why not put her in the hot seat? The room broke into laughter. Heads turned. Phones slipped halfway out of pockets. The joke had landed and the show was about to start. Sarah didn't respond. She held her clipboard tighter, her knuckles pale, but her face didn't move. She had heard worse, survived worse, but the weight of dozens of eyes burned against her skin. Harrington chuckled again, said it'd be educational. 5 minutes in the cockpit, engines off, just a peek. What could go wrong? Major Brooks, who rarely spoke unless cornered, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Colonel Reeves, older and quieter, rubbed his jaw like the paperwork had already started writing itself. No one told Harrington to stop. Sarah looked at the floor for a beat, then back at Harrington. Her voice came soft even. Said, if it would help the crew understand better, she'd do it. The room fell into that half-silence that feels like disbelief. No one had expected her to say yes, least of all Harrington. He blinked, then smiled wider. Said great, they'd get a suit for her, maybe clean off the backup helmet and let the base get a look at what initiative really looked like. The laughter that followed had a new edge to it, less friendly, more curious. Sarah nodded once and turned to leave the room. Her hands didn't shake, but her heartbeat pushed against her ribs like a second voice, one she couldn't ignore. In the hallway, she walked slower than usual. Every step forward pulled her closer to the cockpit she had once called home. She knew she'd have to be careful. Not too fast, not too smooth. Just capable enough to play along without giving herself away. But a part of her also knew that something had shifted. Harrington thought he'd set the trap. What he didn't realize was that she'd lived in one for 8 years. And you don't fear cages once you've learned how to fly around them. Still, as she stepped into the prep room and zipped up the stiff flight suit, her chest felt tight. The silence that followed her wasn't empty. It was watching. Waiting. She looked into the mirror and didn't see the tech everyone dismissed. She saw someone else. Someone who had survived disgrace without losing direction. Someone who remembered exactly what every switch and dial inside that cockpit meant. The moment hadn't come yet, but it was getting close. And for the first time in years, Sarah wasn't entirely sure what she would do when it arrived. The tarmac radiated heat as Sarah walked toward the Griffin X9, its sleek body casting a shadow that stretched across the concrete, like a reminder of everything she'd left behind. Her borrowed flight suit sagged at the knees and elbows, the kind of fit meant to humiliate, more than protect. The helmet in her hands bore a crack along the visor, the kind no real pilot would accept, but no one expected her to go far anyway. She could hear the chuckles behind her. A few claps, some whispers, and the thin scrape of phones being raised. Every step felt like walking through wet sand, not because of fear, but because of the weight of what waited at the top of the ladder. She placed her hand on the side of the aircraft and paused. The metal was warm and pulsing with silent potential. She used to feel this pulse in her chest synced to the engine part of the machine. As she climbed the ladder, her breath grew slower, focused, not nervous, but careful. Like slipping into cold water after years of drought. The cockpit smelled the same. Synthetic leather. Steel. Dust from systems that sat too long without motion. Her fingers brushed the edge of the seat before she lowered herself in. The grip of the harness straps against her shoulder felt like a memory snapping into place. She adjusted the seat out of habit. Then the mirrors. Then the panel light dimmer. Every motion done before she could think, before anyone watching could blink. Outside, the crowd was shifting. Laughter had softened. People leaned closer, eyes narrowing. This wasn't the awkward fumbling they expected. This was something else. Inside, Sarah exhaled once, long and deep. Her hands hovered above the controls. They didn't shake. They pulsed with stillness. The Griffin's layout was different from the fighters she once commanded, but not different enough. Thrust vector controls, elevation trim, auxiliary power switch. Her fingers moved without rush, finding every system in the order they were meant to come alive. Battery on, avionics up, fuel flow confirmed, engine start. The hum beneath her feet began low and steady, a vibration that crawled into her bones. Systems across the console blinked green in sequence, no hesitation, no error. She ran through checks faster than most active pilots. Hydraulic pressure normal, trim settings balanced, flight computers synced. Her right hand settled over the throttle, not pushing it, just resting as if the machine needed to know she was home. Outside the canopy, someone cursed under their breath. Another phone dropped to a side. Harrington's grin had vanished 3 steps ago. Now he just stared. Sarah kept her eyes forward. The crowd didn't exist anymore. Just her and the sound of breathing and power. Just her and the memory of what it felt like to be trusted with flight. The final system came online with a soft chime. The Griffin was ready, fully powered, fully prepped, fully under control. She didn't move the aircraft. That wasn't the point. But in that stillness, in the silence that fell across the airfield like fog, she did something louder than takeoff. She belonged again. Behind the glass, she watched a reflection of herself. The smudged visor, the sharp line of her jaw, the quiet strength she hadn't seen in years. This wasn't about proving anything. Not to them, not even to herself. It was about remembering, about breathing in the same rhythm as the machine, about hearing the world hold its breath because someone they underestimated just rewrote every assumption. The moment stretched, long enough for phones to lower, long enough for someone to whisper something that sounded like respect. Sarah powered down the sequence just as smoothly as she started. Switches off, systems quiet, the engine spun to stillness like a sigh finally exhaled. She opened the canopy and climbed down slowly, her movements exact. The silence followed her. No one laughed. No one moved. The pilot's suit still didn't fit right. The helmet still bore its crack. But Sarah walked past Harrington without needing to look at him. He wasn't the challenge. He was just the noise she'd let fade. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She didn't need to. The airbase that had forgotten her just remembered who she was, and they wouldn't forget again. The Griffin X9 lifted from the tarmac with barely a sound, its vertical thrusters holding steady as Sarah eased the collective. Her hands moved like water, smooth and confident, syncing instinct with system. Inside the cockpit, the hum of instruments layered over the low roar of power building beneath her. She didn't hesitate. As soon as the nose tilted forward, she transitioned into jet mode, climbing fast through the clear desert sky. Below, the airfield shrank. Ahead, a network of canyons and hills waited, mapped for a combat search and rescue simulation that no one thought she'd survive, let alone master. She pushed the throttle and the Griffin surged forward, slicing through air that felt like old memory. The first checkpoint blinked on her screen and she banked hard into a rightward descent, hugging terrain at 200 feet. The radar barely blinked. She was too low, too fast, too precise. The system threw a simulated missile lock. She countered without blinking, flipping to manual ECM and diving under the ridgeline. Her left hand adjusted pitch while her right danced across countermeasure toggles. The lock dropped. She kept moving. Time blurred. Wind buffeted the canopy, but she stayed smooth. The Griffin responded like it had waited years for this. Each turn tighter, each adjustment cleaner. She cut angles most pilots feared to try, flew between stone and sky like both belonged to her. The rescue beacon pulsed on her nav screen. Simulated enemy drones activated. Sarah dropped speed, let them overrun, then used the Griffin's dual-engine thrust to pivot and climb. She rose like a flare, spun midair, then dropped behind them. No wasted motion. No showboating. At the beacon site, she hovered in a box canyon. The Griffin steadied in air so thin most aircraft buckled. She used micro-corrections to keep position while the simulated extraction played out. Her breathing stayed calm. Her jaw never tensed. Once the package was secured, she shot forward again, cutting through a gap between 2 plateaus with inches to spare. Alarms chirped once. She ignored them. Everything was within spec. The machine trusted her. She trusted herself. Back at the airfield, stopwatches were frozen. Record time for the full route was 31 minutes. She was already halfway back at 12. On the ground, voices had stopped. No one knew what to say. She angled into final descent, slowed with perfect reverse thrust, and dropped gear at the last second. The Griffin landed as soft as a sigh, right on the mark, right on time. Inside the cockpit, Sarah didn't celebrate. She powered down with the same care she started. Her breath came slow and even, like the mission had never shaken her. But behind her stillness, something else stirred. Not pride, not vengeance. Something deeper. She had flown not to prove them wrong. She had flown to remind herself that no one could erase what was real. Not lies, not silence, not time. The sky had never stopped being hers. She had just been waiting for the right moment to take it back. The roar of the Griffin's engines had barely faded when the sound of sirens cut through the base. A convoy of black SUVs appeared at the edge of the flight line tires, kicking up dust as they barreled toward the landing pad. The lead vehicle bore a 3-star flag that left no room for doubt. General Nathaniel Briggs stepped out before the last engine even shut off. He wore his dress uniform like armor medals glinting in the harsh sun, but his eyes went straight to Sarah. He didn't ask questions. He already knew. The crowd, still stunned from the flight, turned as one. Phones came up again. Whispers flared. Harrington's jaw tensed as if his mouth had turned to stone. Briggs didn't wait for introductions. He walked into the middle of the silence and raised his voice like it had once called men into battle. He pointed towards Sarah and asked if anyone present knew who she really was. Someone mumbled. A tech dropped a wrench. Harrington blinked hard and looked down. The general's tone hardened. Said her name wasn't Sarah Miles. Said it was Captain Sarah Holloway. Said she was once the finest pilot the Air Force had ever trained, the only survivor of Operation Valiant Ridge, and the scapegoat in one of the worst military betrayals in recent memory. The words hit like cold air in a sealed room. He spoke of falsified reports, buried testimony, and a cover-up led by men who feared her strength. He said he had failed to stop it 8 years ago, but he wasn't failing now. From his jacket, Briggs pulled a sealed envelope. The wax broke in one clean motion. He read the official orders aloud, each word crisp and final. Full restoration of rank. Promotion to major. Command of the newly formed Griffin Tactical Wing. Back pay. Honors returned. Sarah didn't flinch. She stood beside the aircraft as if the wind itself was holding her steady. Her face was still, but her eyes were locked on Briggs, unreadable and calm. Harrington stumbled back a step. His shoulders sagged. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. Whatever shield his name once gave him had shattered. Around them, people shifted. No one spoke. No one dared. A few looked at Sarah like they were seeing her for the first time. Others couldn't meet her eyes at all. The general walked to her slower now and saluted. She returned it smooth and exact, the kind of salute that comes from years of doing it without cameras. He offered her the papers. She didn't reach for them. She didn't need to say anything. The flight had spoken for her. The silence of 8 years had just been broken with truth so loud it echoed across the base. What had once been erased was now carved into memory, not because someone granted it, but because she had earned it. Because skill survives shame. Because integrity can't be buried forever. And now, with the sun at her back and the Griffin behind her, Sarah Holloway stood not just as a soldier returned. She stood as the living proof that truth, even when silenced, finds its voice again. Sarah stood still as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the hangar. The wind tugged lightly at her sleeves, but she didn't move. The official papers weighed nothing in her hand, yet felt heavier than anything she had carried into flight. General Briggs waited, unsure now, his certainty slipping. Around them, silence had returned, not from awe this time, but confusion. Everyone expected her to say yes. Everyone thought this was her victory. She looked at him with a quiet kind of peace. Not defiant. Not proud. Just sure. She said she appreciated the truth finally being acknowledged, but she didn't need the title to tell her who she was. Briggs started to protest, but she raised a hand gently. Said she wasn't angry, just done chasing what no longer held meaning, that her name had survived in silence, and that was enough. The general lowered his eyes, then nodded. Amanda, standing behind a line of stunned recruits, looked like the air had left her lungs. Her voice cracked when she asked if Sarah was really leaving. Sarah didn't answer right away. She gave a soft smile, not the kind that seeks forgiveness, but the kind that says goodbye without drama. Then she walked away, each step measured, as if the decision had been waiting for years to be made. That night, the container at the edge of the base sat open for the first time in 8 years. The light inside was warm, soft. On the cot, her coveralls were folded into a perfect square. Next to them lay the old flight badge, polished clean. A photo of her beside her first jet rested on top edges worn thin, and beneath that, a single envelope addressed in careful script. Amanda found it the next morning when she knocked, and no one answered. She stepped inside, hesitating. The place smelled like engine oil and coffee grounds, like someone had lived fully in every quiet inch. The letter was short. It said she had flown once for her country, and again for truth. But now she was flying for herself. At the bottom, a message waited. It said, "If you ever feel invisible, don't change your light to fit their blindness. Keep it steady. Someone will see." Amanda folded the letter and sat down. She didn't cry. Not right away. She just looked around and realized the space felt less like an ending and more like a handoff. Sarah didn't leave in protest. She left in peace. The kind that comes when you know what you've survived can never be taken back, and that sometimes the greatest power isn't reclaiming what was stolen. It's knowing you no longer need to. And on that quiet morning with no crowd, no applause, and no rank, Sarah Holloway disappeared from the airbase. Not because she was forgotten, but because her story had already landed exactly where it was meant to. Snow still clung to the mountains behind Hawthorne Aviation Academy, the kind that stayed long after the cold was gone. The runways here weren't polished like a military base, but they were clean, reliable, and built by hand. Most of the hangars had been repurposed from old barns, and no one here cared what patch you once wore. Sarah stood with her hands in her jacket pockets, watching the sun cut through the early haze. Behind her, the smell of jet fuel mixed with black coffee and pine. The academy wasn't fancy, but every bolt and screw had been placed with intention. 6 months had passed since she left Desert Ridge. She hadn't gone far, just far enough to build something no one could take from her. Hawthorne wasn't in the news, but people knew about it now, especially the ones who'd been told their best years were behind them. Amanda walked across the tarmac with a clipboard and aviators perched on her head. She wore confidence now, not like armor, but like skin that finally fit. She briefed a trainee with quiet precision, then gave Sarah a small nod before stepping back. Carlos stood by the Griffin trainer, his hands shaking slightly as he climbed in. He was 19, a former mechanic's son who had fixed more engines than he had test scores. He wasn't supposed to be here, but here that didn't matter. Sarah watched from a distance, arms crossed but eyes soft. He adjusted the seat like she once did. Took a breath before flipping the master switch. The engine came to life with a clean, even whine. It was a sound that still settled deep in her chest. No one clapped. No one shouted. But in that silence, something important was happening. Carlos lifted off for his solo flight with the kind of grace that couldn't be taught, only discovered. On the wall inside the office, a small wooden plaque read, "Fly your own course." The hashtag had started as a quiet message between instructors, but now it lived on flight jackets and coffee mugs. People across the country had begun sending letters asking if there was space for one more. Veterans who never fit into suits. Women passed over for the same role 3 times. Men with rough hands and soft voices who had never been heard. Sarah didn't promise them rank or recognition. She gave them tools, trust, and time. She stepped back as Carlos disappeared into the clouds. The noise faded and the stillness returned. She let her eyes close for a moment and listened to the silence. It didn't echo with what had been lost anymore. It held what had been built. Flying had never been about speed or medals. It had been about knowing where you are when you are weightless, about understanding that freedom isn't something given, it's something reclaimed. Teaching wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about creating space for others to speak. Forgiveness didn't come all at once. It arrived in quiet pieces like morning light through a hangar door. Sarah walked back toward the academy without a word. No cameras, no orders, just footsteps and a sky that finally felt wide enough for everyone.